Sometimes the simplest story you find online, it can kick off the wildest, most fascinating community reactions. So today, we're going to dive into one of those. It's a tale from Reddit that starts with something super relatable, a workplace annoyance, but it ends up showing us so much about how we all act online. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so this all kicks off on the subreddit r/pettyrevenge, and it starts with a problem I think we've all kind of dealt with. Picture this. You're in a busy office, and there's this one coworker, the author calls him Dave, who's a serial charger thief. And I mean, this guy doesn't just borrow it, he'll literally unplug the author's phone just to charge his own. The nerve, right?
So the original poster is totally fed up, but, doesn't want that awkward, direct confrontation. So what do? They cook up this classic petty revenge scheme. It's simple, it's elegant, and it's a perfectly non-confrontational way to deal with this daily headache.
And the genius of this plan is just how simple it is. The author digs up an old charger that looks exactly the same as their good one, but it charges at a snail's pace. I mean, we were talking 5% charge in 30 minutes. Painful! So they leave this decoy charger on their desk, hide the real fast charger, and just wait for Dave to take the bait.
And of course, the plan worked like a charm. Over just 1 week, you can see Dave's frustration just building and building. First, he's just annoyed. Then he starts blaming the building's outlets. And finally, he gives up and actually solves his own problem. So the author gets exactly what they wanted. No arguments needed. A clean victory, right? Well, maybe not.
Because even though the author's story was basically over, the community story was just getting started, and the very first thing they latched onto was the post's title. It was called "The Coworker Who Always Borrowed My Charger Got a Shocking Surprise." And that title immediately raised a question that just flooded the comments section. See, the community read that and their imaginations just went wild. They were promised something dramatic, something with a real jolt.
I mean, the disconnect between expectation and reality was just huge. People were in the comments expecting literal electricity, a melted phone. One person even said they hoped someone was going to ride the lightning. But what did they get? Mild inconvenience, and a guy complaining about the outlets. The reality was just way too tame for that shocking promise in the title.
Yeah, this one comment from a user named snoo_13783 really nails that collective feeling of being let down. The whole community felt like they'd been sold a bill of goods, and that feeling of disappointment, that was the first major direction the comment thread went in. But it definitely wasn't the last.
So, once that initial disappointment kind of wore off, the community turned its, let's call it, analytical eye on both the author and the story, and they came back with 2 new verdicts. And let me tell you, they were pretty harsh.
Okay, first up, they went after the author. A lot of commenters, like this one from Plaque Plague, felt the whole elaborate plan was just a way to get out of having a simple, direct conversation. Their argument was, just tell Dave to stop. They were really critical of what they saw as a cowardly and passive-aggressive move. And then second, they started judging the story itself. More and more people started to question if any of this was even real. You started seeing comments like this one from Wallaby in Training, saying the whole thing just reads like AI. It felt generic, formulaic, almost like a machine wrote it.
And then it gets even better. The investigation went a step further. Wallaby in Training didn't just make the accusation, they brought receipts. They actually fed a simple prompt into ChatGPT and posted what it spit out. And the AI-generated story was shockingly similar to the original post. I mean, right down to the tone and the structure, and that was enough to convince a whole lot of people that the story was totally fake.
But this is where things get really interesting for me. Because while all this was going on, people debating the title, the author's courage, whether the story was real, a completely different thing started happening. The community just latched on to the super generic name the author gave the coworker, Dave.
And this is just a classic example of an online in-joke, right? It's that thing where a community grabs one tiny detail and just spins it into this shared piece of humor that everyone's in on. And in this thread, the name Dave, it became a full-blown cultural touchstone. All of a sudden, the comments were just filled with Dave jokes. You had people riffing on the whole stereotype of what it means to be a Dave. You had classic movie references like Dave's Not Here, Man, and my personal favorite, a user who's actually named David C. Mayberry, complaining that guys like this ruin our brand. I mean, the name Dave itself became way more entertaining than the story it came from.
So what's the takeaway here? What does this all add up to? Well, if you take a step back and look at all these different threads of conversation, you realize something. The original post wasn't just a story people were reading. No, it was more like a catalyst.
And looking at a breakdown of the comments makes this crystal clear. A tiny, tiny fraction of the comments, we're talking just 5%, were actually about the story itself. The vast majority, they were busy deconstructing the title, judging the author, investigating if it was real, and, I think most creatively, building this whole new narrative around the name Dave.
And that is the core insight here. The story of the slow charger, that was just the opening line. The community, they wrote the rest of the book. They weren't just a passive audience reading something. They were actively jumping in, creating and shaping the meaning and, let's be honest, the fun of the whole thing.
So it kind of leaves you with this final thought. When we're scrolling for stories online, maybe the real story isn't in the original post at all. Maybe it's in that chaotic, critical, and honestly super creative swirl happening down in the comments. And it really makes you wonder, what's actually more revealing? The story that's being told or the community that's gathered around to listen?